Okay, so yeah, thanks again everyone for joining. I hope you had a great weekend. So today is actually our third to the final session. So today we have Sam who's going to be teaching about semantic segmentation. And then the next two sessions next week are we're going to go into NLP, two sessions there. And then after next week on the Wednesday, we have our phase 2 closing ceremony. And just a reminder for everyone, if you have missed some sessions, you can go ahead and complete the quizzes, and that way you can still keep up your attendance. Yeah. So Sam is a senior applied AI scientist, so he has extensive industrial and academic experience working with biomedical data, signal processing, medical imaging, natural language processing, speech recognition, and e-commerce data analysis. He's currently working as a senior applied scientist, working on enterprise-level automatic speech recognition systems. Previously, he was working with a team of neurological scientists on brain-computer interfaces. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Sam, and he'll be teaching us about semantic segmentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew, for your nice introduction. And hello, everyone. I hope you're having a great weekend. I'm actually here in Vancouver, so it's a little bit cloudy. It's a bummer for us. I don't know where you guys at, but hopefully you're getting enough sunshine. So today's session, as Andrew also mentioned, we're going to talk and cover like semantic segmentation. But I'm trying to do, I want to actually make this session a little bit less mathy, just like a combination of some theories and application, like a hands-on application. So you don't confuse, you don't get confused or overwhelmed by all the materials that we're going to cover, especially considering deep neural networks, and some of the concepts could be a little bit challenging to understand for some of you that might not have had any previous exposure to them. So also, let's make this session a little bit more attractive. So please put your, again, questions in the chat. Let me actually bring up the chat here and start sharing my screen, and then we can kick off the session. Okay, I hope you guys can see my screen. As Andrew also mentioned in the chat, there's a Git repository that you can actually access. As part of the Git repository, there's a README. If you can go through the README, again, the Git repository is not super clean because I had to just rush. Everything was rushed. I had to put stuff quickly. So it's not a good practice of just in terms of software engineering, some of you are picky about some of the software engineering practices. Just take it as a grain of salt. This is not the best practice, but just like to get you exposed with some of the materials there, I put like a Medium blog too, so you can go through it. I'll share that with you actually. If you go to, it says here, if you go to the GitHub, you wouldn't see all this stuff, but let's actually, this is the repository that I was mentioning. So it's public. You should be able to see it. Again, as part of this, this is there's this reference, which is a Medium blog. So you can go through all this stuff in much greater details. We're going to cover some of the sections of this today as well. We might not be able to cover the whole thing because towards the end it gets a little bit complex, but I'll do my best to actually cover the important segments of it. Do you guys have any question, anything that you want to bring up before we start? And again, don't be shy. You can just log on mute. You can put your question in the chat. We're all friends here. We're learning stuff. So again, don't be shy. Try to ask your questions as we go. So again, I'll put like an agenda here. So we can go through it. So we're going to cover like an overview of segmentation, and basically we're going to define the problem. What is segmentation in the first place? And what is semantic segmentation? We're going to cover all that. I'm going to give you some theoretical background. We're going to check some of the models that are being used for semantic segmentation, and we're going to touch on like a use case here using this Jupyter notebook. Again, you have access to this notebook, and you can train the model with just like some line of code that is provided to you here as part of this notebook. And you have an assignment too that I will talk about towards the end of the session. For some of you who are curious and want to optimize the model a little bit further, you can again access this GitHub repository, clone the repository, and just like do further optimization. Any questions so far? Okay, so let's see what segmentation is. Again, I want this session to be more interactive. I know you've already seen some of this stuff, but who can put in the chat? What would you consider segmentation in simple terms? There's no wrong or right answer. Just like you can put your answers in the chat, and we can start the conversation and we can we'll move forward. Any idea? What is how do we define segmentation? What's your understanding of a segmentation? Okay, I see some good answers. Aaron has mentioned a portion of the set of pixels in an image file. That's a great start. Sergio says separate parts of an image from what you want, from noise. Great answers. Dividing things. Sort of. Again, we'll get into the distinctions, but I see some really good answers. Dividing things into smaller parts. Again, sort of, but good answers. Good first intuitions. Creating beat masks for objects. That's actually a nice term. It was after a long time that I'm actually seeing this term, beat masks. That's nice keyword you used, Daniel, there. That's good. Okay, yeah, great answer. Creating beat masks for objects. I see so many good answers. So it seems that some of you guys have like a basic understanding of what segmentation is. Again, I used to basically create PowerPoints, but I figured it's better I'm not gonna go through all the text. I'm just gonna touch on the important parts of it and we move forward, and you can use it as your reference later. So I figured this is more useful to learners and students over the course of like the past few months. So again, what is segmentation? Image segmentation is a computer vision task. There's so many different tasks within computer vision domain. Again, we have different domains in AI, and as you go through all these domains, you get familiar with different subcategories. For example, for computer vision, we have classification tasks, which I think basically studied a little bit. We have segmentation, which we're going to go through, and some other tasks. So image segmentation is a computer vision task in which we label specific regions of an image according to what's being shown. So in simple term, I like this actually definition. What's in this image and where in the image is it located? So we're going to answer two questions: what and where. And again, I want you to pay attention to these two main keywords. They're pretty important. And that's where the distinctions basically come from. Distinction from the specific task of image segmentation versus classification, and so forth. So more specifically, the goal of semantic image segmentation is to label each pixel. We're going to deal with pixel itself rather than basically the whole frame. So the goal of semantic image segmentation is to label each pixel of an image with the corresponding class of what is being represented. For example, if you look at this image, it's made of a lot of pixels, right? Tiny pixels. What we want to do, we want to basically identify pixel by pixel, basically objects that are distinct. So for example, we have all these bikes, we have basically different persons, and we have the background, of course. So that's the definition of basically semantic segmentation. And why do we call it semantic? Because we want to capture the semantic of it, right? The meaning of the segmentation, what is being shown. So that's why this what is really important. For example, there's a person, or there are multiple persons, there are bikes, and there's a background. And you can get into greater details, for example. That's the beauty of image segmentation, for example, specifically for biomedical data. You can, in the context of this image, for example, you can actually segment the handle of the bike, and you can assign it a different label. And you can basically try to predict person, bike, the handle of the bike, and the background. And of course, it gets a little bit more complicated when it comes to training and prediction, but it's all possible. Does that make sense so far? Is everything clear? Nice. So again, an example of semantic segmentation where the goal is to predict class label for each pixel was in this image that we saw. And one other famous example, of course, you are familiar with Tesla and their autonomous driving and stuff like that. That's actually a very popular use case. We're going to talk about one of the data sets that you can use to train such model as our hands-on practice here too in today's session. But it's basically autonomous driving and autonomous vehicles. As part of the algorithm, basically what they're trying to do is they're trying to segment, and of course they're trying to do semantic segmentation of different objects when a car is driving itself. So we are able to actually identify cars and identify, for example, passengers, identify, for example, people who are walking on the sidewalk, all these basic signs, street signs, and so forth. So these all happen using semantic segmentation. So that's why many people are interested about like this topic. It's a very hot topic these days. Another example of it, just to give you more motivation, is like medical image diagnosis. For example, you go to a radiologist and you go, for example, for ultrasound, and like you get your X-ray results, and then the goal is to, for example, for a general practitioner or like let's say someone who's a surgeon, to go and identify anomalies that exist within your, let's say, your lungs, or for example, liver or your kidney. So with the use of computer science and all these algorithms, semantic segmentation, you can segment each part of your, for example, body. And if there's an anomaly, you can quickly identify that and help, for example, the surgeons, general practitioners, and so radiologists to move towards like a better diagnosis. So that's, again, another very interesting topic for research. And here you can see we have an input image and we have the segmented image. So again, the whole purpose of segmentation is to answer these two questions. What's in this image? And where in the image is it located? So again, just to put an emphasis on how important these two keywords are. So before getting further into the detail, I just want to again emphasize on some of the distinction between different tasks of image recognition, basically computer vision. So we have object detection, where the only objective, the only purpose is to detect different objects within the image. So you have, for example, multiple people, and you want to create bounding boxes. You can see like these bounding boxes. We call these bounding boxes, these rectangles around like each persona. And that's the whole purpose of object detection, to detect specific objects and put bounding boxes on them. And then we have semantic segmentation, where again, we talk about like what's in the image and where are they located within that image, and like assign a tag to it in a semantic manner. For example, we're dealing with all these persons, and we have segmented those. And then there's another area of computer vision, which is instance segmentation. So again, I want you to understand the distinction between these two. There's a difference between semantic segmentation and instance segmentation. Instance segmentation would identify each individual person. So not only can identify, for example, one entity, let's say person or trees or streets, but it can get into a further polished detail. You can say, okay, for example, this is Sam, this is Andrew, this is Daniel, but they are of one category persons. So that's the task of instance segmentation, which is slightly different from semantic segmentation. So again, object detection is like a classic classification problem within computer vision. That's why you can quickly use, for example, convolutional neural networks. It's simpler than semantic segmentation, and you can basically create bounding boxes and identify objects. Semantic segmentation builds upon that. It goes a few steps further, and it tries to put meanings into those objects that you define, and basically segment. It would try to segment those objects. Instance segmentation goes even further and basically identify individual basically personas or like details within the categories that we have segmented. Does that make sense to everyone? Is everything clear? Can put a thumbs up in the chat. I just want to make sure you guys are not falling asleep. My probably boring lecture. Are you guys awake? Nice. I see only Daniel and Robert saying yes. Hopefully all the other people. Okay, there you go. Nice. Okay, so now moving further, let's go back to understanding of the framework and how basically these models work. We talked about some of the use cases, autonomous vehicles, medical image diagnosis. This is actually a pretty nice topic. Again, for some of you who are interested in doing R&D and research, for example, tumors in the brain or kidney stones, or for example, problems with the lung or kidney or liver and all that kind of stuff, we can solve those problems with semantic segmentation. And that's a very hot topic in research, which again is still being nurtured. Just like the researchers are trying to optimize models to further improve on such detections. So how do we represent such tasks? How do we define input data? How do we start doing the modeling? Just on a paper from theoretical aspect of it. Again, I try to make everything super simple so you guys can understand. If you want to get into further details, again, I've written this blog. You can go very deep into the detail, and I put like the links here. If you want to study further, to see like how things work under the hood in greater details, you can check all these links. You can actually check some of the sources that are provided here and so forth. So make sure to check this out. Okay, going back here. So for any image classification or any vision problem or vision task, we should have an input data, right? And what's the input data? It's an image, right? And one pop question, I don't know if you guys remember from the previous session, how do we represent data usually in Python, or how do we represent image data usually in Python? Any idea? Just to, excellent. Aaron, just like quickly type NumPy array. What else? We have another tensors, PyTorch tensor sometimes. Tensors are arrays. They're the same thing with different names. Excellent, excellent responses. So again, for computers to understand what they're dealing with, we have this image. For example, you go out, you take photos, or for example, X-ray scans, they scan different parts of your body, and they would output an image, which is digital, right? So now our first initial task is to interpret these images, which could be in RGB, right? It could they would have colors, or they could be on grayscale, just like black and white, to computers. How do we interpret those? we basically represent those as part of like a tensors or NumPy arrays with numbers, integers or float points. So for semantic, basically segmentation, what we have, our goal is to take either a RGB color image or a grayscale image and output a segmentation map. Again, I'll talk about all these keywords, but these are very important keywords, where each pixel contain a class label represented as an integer. So again, you know how classification works, for example, in machine vision. For example, for cats and dogs, those are classification tags, the tasks. We have an image of a cat, for example, and we want to create those bounding boxes and say, okay, this is an image of a cat, like with probability of 80%. This is an image of a dog with probability of 90%. But for segmentation, the way we present basically the problem, again, we use the same concept of different classes, but we represent those in a slightly different way. So if you would have this input image, it basically has so many different pixels, right? Small pixels. So what we do, basically, we try to replace the pixel number with the class number. So for example, here we know there are different, for example, our intention is to use 5 classes. And for example, we classify the tree and all this kind of stuff, like this background, like this whole portion as a class that belongs to plants or grass. And we will assign this number, like 3 to it. So you would see this portion of the image is tagged by the class number, like class 3. So we have, for example, number 1, which again, it's a person. So again, different classes. We identify different classes and we assign different numbers to it, and we replace them within the image, that again, pixel location. Does that make sense to everyone? I'm gonna get into basically into a little bit more details, but I just want you to understand the core concept. This is the core concept of some basically semantic segmentation. Is that clear to everyone? Do you guys understand how these ones are basically formed? Oh, I missed actually chat. Okay, yes. Aaron has mentioned tensors are not arrays. That's absolutely correct. Basically, they're different by nature, but they have some similarities. Again, if you remember the first or second session that we had, we talked about like arrays and tensors, their differences. We had a session on that, but the core concept is the same. Basically, they are placeholders that would keep some float numbers or integers or like different data types of the same category. For example, all integer or all floats. But there are some distinctions, and we talked about it in the previous session. So you can basically check out the previous slides of the previous sessions. Okay, that's good. So if you look at this, if you look at the semantic labels, if we basically pick up the semantic labels and put that on the input image, all these, for example, ones, like the person would overlay this person. So for example, all the number 3s here would overlay the tree and the grass. Number 4 is the sidewalk, would overlay, would go on top of, for example, the sidewalk. And number 5, for example, the building, again, will go over the building. So that's the concept of overlay. Again, I'll talk about it in a bit, but so okay, let's talk about this one. So we talk about the input image. Again, who can tell me usually what is the dimension again, there's no right or wrong answer. I just want to make sure if you guys have like a good understanding from the previous session, or when we usually get like an input image, what is the dimension of that input image? Again, you don't have to give me numbers. You can give me numbers, but I want to see if you're familiar with the dimension of an image. Like how many dimension does it have, or would it possibly have? And you can give me an instance or can give me an example. That's okay too. Excellent. That's what I was looking for. Daniel, great answer. Sergio, great answer. Uh, Possibly dimension 3 for height, width, and basically for RGB, right? The dimension, because each image would consist of 3 main colors, red, green, blue, and the combination of those would create like a wide spectrum of colors. And each one, each basically scale of color would change from 0 to 255, right? And what was 0? Again, who can tell me what 0 was and what 255 was? Is it more dark or more like whites? Who knows? 0 black, 255 whites. Yes. Excellent. So again, let's imagine we have the semantic labels. So what we want to build is something like this. You can see this is how you can see how this basically tensor or like this image is spatial, like it expands in the space. So we have height, width, and now we basically represent the basically you can call it the depth as the number of classes that we have for these, again, semantic labels that can get input, that can be the input to the algorithm that we're going to talk about. So we have the height, the width, and the class. So again, the first class was the person, right? So we put all the, basically we transform this semantic label into something that we call one-hot encoding formats. So again, that's another important concept that I want you to learn and master, basically. When people, or when you read a paper and you you basically see this term, one-hot encoding, it's basically this. You get a tensor or like an array of numbers, and we would just like convert them into 0 and 1s. That's all we do. And that's what we call one-hot encoding. So we get this and we expand it in the space. And we represent that as this one-hot encoded labels. So for example, the first dimension, it has again height and width. It's the number of pixels for the input image. But all the other areas are represented by 0. Only these segments, this portion that represent this person is represented by 1s. And again, this one is the purse. So number 2. And you can see it's like a tiny, basically portion of this whole image. So it's here. That is basically identified or tagged as pairs. Someone may argue, okay, what about this band? You can also tag that, but like one challenge for semantic segmentation is finding ground truth label. So that's very expensive to find. That's one of the challenges of such tasks. You have to find labeled or annotated data sets to train your model based on. And sometimes people do a lazy job and it's just like label only, there's some annotation tools that you can use. Again, you can read my blog and just like learn more about it. But it's basically using polygons. If you're familiar with polygons, you just like create bounding boxes or like vertices connected by lines around different objects, and you tag them as, hey, this is a purse, and then you convert them into different values. So for purse, we only have this segment, and then we have like this whole area of grass and trees. So here, and of course the sidewalk and so forth. And that's the idea of overlay that I was talking about. Again, my whole purpose in this session is to make you familiar with all the core concepts in segmentation, deep learning, especially for machine vision tasks. And then we go through like the hands-on, so you can get a little bit more familiar with like the code itself as well. But once you get familiar with all these terms, when you read the paper, when you go to different GitHub repositories, everything would make sense. There's nothing fancy about it. So that's the idea of overlay. When researchers talk about overlay, and you see here that basically keyword is just like picking up the semantic labels, putting it on the input image, and making sure they would represent the right labels. Does that make sense? So you can see number 4 is here, 3 here, 5 here, and then you can see like a small portion of purse, like here. So there's another term that I want you to get familiar with, and that's mask. Again, if you want to get into industry, if you want to do research at the lab, that's another important concept. When we overlay a single channel of our target, we refer to this as a mask. And again, that falls into this like a natural explanation of or like the meaning of mask. It's a mask on top of the original photo. Exactly, like a bit mask. But that's why, like, I was happy with the. I think Daniel mentioned that, like a beat mask. That's like a technical term that now is a little bit obsolete. Usually people say like mask simply or like an overlay. That's why I was surprised to see that, and that's a good sign. That's good. So, um, all up to this point, we talked about what semantic segmentation is, what the applications could be, and basically how you can represent the label, how you can find the input. Of course, the input are the images, this image, and how you can actually make sure the labels are correct. How do we usually deal with labels and all that kind of stuff. So again, input an image, like all the other tasks, like classification tasks, semantic labels, that was different. We talked about it. We said, okay, now we're going to get a little bit into more detail of each segment, and we're going to, tag these ones differently compared to classification. For classification, we had only cats and dogs. Do you remember? So we had this image, and the input would be basically the input would be again the same, the image. The output would be either one cat or dog. We wouldn't have like this pixel-wise segmentation or labeling. But now, for semantic segmentation, we have such basically detail. And then we talk about how we can extend like the semantic labels and basically transform them into a one-hot encoding so the model can learn basically off of it. So now we're going to get into different architectures that exist to handle such basically complicated tasks. Do you guys have any questions so far up to this point, or everything is clear? Okay, I assume everything is clear. Let's move to the next part. So we'll come back to this. Actually, there's nothing. Let's further go and just make you familiar with all this stuff. So for constructing an architecture, again, I assume you guys are familiar with basically CNN, convolutional neural networks, right? Because that's my first assumption that you guys have like an understanding of convolutional neural networks. I'll talk about it a little bit, but I hope you guys have a somewhat good understanding of it. So for image classification, okay, that's good. So if you recall, for image classification task, we had basically convolutional neural networks, CNNs, plus some basically dense layers. And then the dense layers, again, who can tell me what the dense layers are? Just like to make sure you guys remember from the previous sessions some of these concepts. So we had basically convolutional layers, and then we had the dense layers. What is the distinction? What's the difference between these two? What is what's the difference between convolutional layers and dense layers? Again, don't be shy. There's no right or wrong answer. You can just like put your thoughts in the chat, even if that's a guess, and then I'll give you a hint. I think you guys are thinking maybe we had the concept of filters, and okay, Sergio, as mentioned, a layer that has all connected nodes. Okay, what do we call that, Sergio? Is that convolution, or is that like a fully connected layer? Is that like a dense layer? Fully connected or dense, basically. So again, as the name tells, when we talk about dense layers, they're dense, right? They're dense, they're fully connected. So when you hear, or when you see that term, fully connected or dense layers, we talk about like nodes, neural nodes that are fully connected, and they have like an activation function, and they do like a regression, y ax plus b. So that's what we call a fully connected or a dense layer. However, convolution layers, again, are filters. So for images, we want to go pixel by pixel, look at each pixel, and basically create features of those pixels, like features that can help the neural networks to basically find specific patterns, right? So those ones are convolutional layers. Does that make sense? So here, again, I'm going to go over some of the previous concepts and talk about their shortcomings on like this semantic segmentation task. So in a naive approach, that's why I would call it naive, because for semantic segmentation, you need something more. For image classification, you had this image input. Again, 3 is the number of dimension, RGB. You had 3 dimension, red, green, blue, and then height and width of the image. And then you had these convolutional layers, which would act as filters. And then they will go pixel by pixel. And again, if you just to refresh your memory, we had the concept of stride, which was like the step, like you pick up the filter, just like imagine a magnifier in form of a rectangle. You pick up the magnifier, again, you move it one step, you look at all the pixels all together, and then again, you move it back, you move further one step, you look at like all the other pixels from very close up. Just an analogy to basically capture the or find the pattern, specific patterns that exist in the pixel of the image. So that's the whole purpose of using the convolution layers. And we would create basically features off of the input image. And one way of solving this problem, let's say we want to get this input and we want to basically produce all these outputs like semantic labels, is to use such network that would basically accept an input image and use bunch of convolutional layers and basically uses an argmax to give us like a probability of basically each class of the pixel belonging to like one of the classes that we've defined. So we can see these are all convolution, and then we have an argmax here. And here we use like a pixel-wise softmax activation. Again, just some fancy words, but if you break it down into like smaller terms, it's very simple, right? We go pixel by pixel and we apply softmax function on top of it. And basically, that's how we produce the prediction. So someone might ask, does it work? And the answer to that is not really. It's very expensive. Why? Because all these convolutional layers, they have trainable weights, right? And in this way, you're reconstructing the whole image again. Like you are basically getting this input image. You are not basically doing a feature reduction. You keep all the features in the image, probably in the memory of your computer, and then you're trying to learn the weights like of the convolutions and going back and forth. It's extremely expensive. Uh, if you want to use like a large image, your memory might blow up. You might need a lot of servers, and it might not actually give you a good answer. So this might work on classification tasks, but if someone asks you, hey, is the use of just fully convolutional layers and applying a Rmax, or even like applying some, dense layers towards the end, would it help to get a better like a response? Is it a good methodology for basically semantic segmentation? You would say no, not really. So then the question is, what's a better solution? Just before moving to that part, do you guys have any question? Did you guys understand the concept of this? Again, don't worry about the details. I just want you to understand the whole concept around semantic segmentation, and when we have such models, or what convolutions are, how, for example, they work and so forth. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, this would work pretty well for classification tasks, but not for semantic segmentation, where you want to basically predict each specific region of a pixel, because it's very computationally expensive. You have to go basically forward and back probe, and then you have to learn all those parameters. You have to adjust them, and you have to do it for individual pixel. That's why you have this pixel-wise SoftBank activation that would take a long time, and usually the model does not converge. Again, that's another term. Converge means getting to a point that is good to use. That would say, okay, I'm happy with this model. It's optimized enough. It can give me a good response. Again, a very naive or simple explanation of what converging tells. So what's the better solution? Then we come to this idea of encoder decoder structure. And again, you would hear this term over and over again, especially for natural language processing as well, when you go into your new session. Recently, recent in the past few years, they came up with this architecture called encoder decoder. And again, if you look at the word itself, it can entail that encoder, it encodes information, decoder, it decodes information. And the whole purpose of such architecture, when it basically came brought into the literature, and then researchers started working on it, and then it got into industry, was to reduce the cost of training models, get a better representation of features, basically holding less features in the memory, but the features that are important. Again, when I talk about features, I talk about specific patterns that you will see in the pixel of an image. So that's why encoder decoder structure came into picture to answer all these questions. Can we reduce the cost? Can we optimize the model further? Can we use like better representation of these pixels, hold them in memory, and still learn like a decent map to predict what these regions are? And it works pretty good. So how does it work? As part of the encoder, just to make sure you guys are on the same page, you guys have any questions so far? Is everything clear? Okay. Not sure about all the other fellows, but just only see Sergio, Huang, and sometimes they're actually doing a thumbs up. So hopefully everyone else is up and just like learn. Okay, Daniel is on board too. That's good. So then basically we started thinking about this decoder and encoder architecture. And again, you would see it in so many different areas. ChatGPT actually, ChatGPT or ChatGPT 4 has like an encoder decoder architecture, which is a little bit more complex than this with something called attention layers. Again, just like to get you familiar with some of these terms, so you guys have heard them. But I just want to emphasize how important this architecture is. It's been used in so many different domains: voice recognition, natural language processing, and image recognition. And it's pretty easy. You have the same input image. Again, it's RGB. You have this height and you have this width. And now look, you have this basically kind of, um, shape that first we reduce the number of features, we encode them into like a less sparse but more meaningful representation, and then we try to reproduce them basically we call it upscale or upsample. We try to decode them to basically again learn the new stuff from them, and then hopefully regenerate the original photo with some of the questions that we want to find answer to. So again, these ones are convolutional layers. So you're familiar with all the components of this encoder decoder. Nothing has been added. We're using convolutional layers. Again, we're using dense layers too sometimes. And the whole purpose of this is to get this input data. Again, I'll get into a little bit of more details, but just at the first glance, we reduce again, you can see the height and width is reduced, but now we are adding to the depth. So the depths are basically the features that we create off of the kernel based on the number of filters that we have. So we go from here to here, we create basically more features, which would hopefully help us to find specific patterns, but they're less sparse, but they're important features. And then this is a low resolution part. And now from that basically large feature set, or all the features that we've collected using the kernels, now we try to again upscale, like make them bigger again, like reconstruct the image again. So from an image which could be 3 by 3, just as a simple example, we reduce it to 1 to 1, but we extract important features, and then from that 1 to 1 pixel image, we upscale to make that 3 by 3 image again, but to also answer the questions we have, which is to generate these predictions, the semantic labels. And that's it. Basically, that's the idea of encoder decoder in simple term. So again, don't fall for those fancy explanation. That's all a encoder decoder does. Does that make sense to everyone? Daniel has actually asked a very good question. This is a bit off topic, but I've heard the ChatGPT models are decoder only. That's true, Daniel. Decoder can be used always with an encoder. So basically, what they try to do, again, it's a little bit off topic, but once you get into natural language processing, it depends on something that we call a downstream task. So for example, ChatGPT whole purpose is to answer questions or like interact with humans based on questions and answers they would ask. So we decode the features, but then for a downstream task, let's say, for example, Sam decides to use those features to do something else. Then I can use basically, I'm sorry, we encode the features, but then I want to use them for a downstream task. So I use a decoder here to use the decoded features to basically answer questions that are coming from humans. So again, it depends on what the problem statement is. If the whole purpose of ChatGPT is to basically interact with people, what you would do, you should always basically create feature sets, which comes from the encoder side of the model. You encode specific features, but then the decoder phase is to now either upsample or upscale to serve something we call, again, a downstream task. So decoder, you can also consider it as downstream task phase. So again, in terms of ChatGPT, for specific models of it, because there are different flavors of GPT models, they might be only using the decoder. They've used pre-trained something, again, some of you might not, I think you've heard the pre-trained models. Pre-trained encoders, you don't need to train it, it's there, but they use a specific decoder architecture, connect these two to serve a downstream task. So that's why sometimes you hear that like it's only decoder, but that's not actually entirely true. They use a pre-trained decoder, but the main focus is on the encoder side, the decoder side to serve a downstream task of their intention. And then Sergio says, when you downsample, do you not lose information? Exactly. That's very important, and that's what I'm going to talk about in this kind of session that's coming. But that's good. Very, very good questions. I'm happy to see all these questions. So again, there are different downsampling and upsampling techniques. As Sergio also mentioned, when you downsample, you lose a specific information because now the spatial resolution is going to shrink, right? And we're going to come up with a bunch of extended feature patterns that hopefully would answer some of the questions we have, but they might not. How do we ensure that we have just enough information and we're not losing so much information to help us answer the question? So there are different upsampling techniques. Some of these upsampling techniques can answer specifically this, Sergio. Like it can help with recovering of the information. So these ones, for example, are very naive. I put some of them here. One of them, for example, nearest neighbor. Let's say I have this input. From this input image, I've used basically a downsampling technique, encoder, and I've came up with, for example, these kernels. Now I want to build upon it. I want to expand it. One idea to go from this 2x2 input to this 4x4 is just like to, in a naive way, say, get the nearest neighbor. Just like put one all around here, 2 here, 3 here, 4 here. Which is very naive, right? So it might work for some very simple tasks, but it might not work for all the other tasks. Another one is called the bed of nails, which is a little bit more famous. And you see why it's called bed of nails. Let's say I want to go from this input of 2x2 to this output of 4x4. I'll put 0 all the way in the other cells, but I will keep basically the first cell with the value that I had. So it's just like a nail, like you can consider this value. This is not non-zero as a nail that is coming up, out of a bed. So these ones are all zeros. And then the same idea here, 0, 0, 0, 2, 0, 0, 0, 3, and 4. Again, pretty naive. Another one, she's a little bit more advanced, but still conventional, is to do max pooling. So you do this max pooling, right? To get like the global averaging. I assume, again, you got familiar with all the stuff in the previous session. But again, you have this output. Again, the same output here, 2x2. And I want to upsample it, upscale it. What I would do, I would say, okay, get the index of this, get the position from the pooling layer. So the position that I had, like this was coming from this basically 1, 2, 3, 4. This one is coming from, for example, this output 5. And this was the position of it. So I would put 1 here, and I would just like put 0 all in the other places. So this 2 comes from, for example, this 6. This 6, the position of it in this max pooling layer was here. So I basically save the index in the memory and then use it for this step. I say, okay, now put number 2 here and then all the other layers 0. Again, this can answer some of the spatial resolution questions. It can recover some more information for you. It's a little bit more advanced, but it still has many limitations. But one very robust method that is working with like a popular model that we're going to use today, right after this basically section ends, we're going to go basically to the Jupyter Notebook, is this idea of transpose convolutions. So the idea is basically you're familiar with again matrix multiplication and the transpose of a matrix. It's kind of the same idea. Again, you have this 2 by 2 matrix. Let's say I want to form this 4 by 4. So usually you would use, for example, a pad of 1. So again, pad of 1 would, again, I would assume you're familiar with this stuff. This part would get a little bit complex. So again, don't worry if you don't understand it fully. There are links to it that you can actually go and read more about it. Actually, let me talk about this, but I put this here for like a better understanding. Let's say I have this input here, A and B, and there's this filter. And I want to basically upsample it. This is like a linear input, right? It has only 2 cells, but I want to extend it to 6 cells, and I have this filter. So the way it works, this idea of transpose convolution, I multiply this individual input of this input, basically inputs like AX, AY, AZ, and I put it in the first 3 cells. And then I move this 1 down to also cover the second input of this input. So it would be BX, BY, BZ. And then I will put it in the basic next 3 cells. But for the cell that these 2 would collide, I would sum their results. So you can see when I basically multiply this A by all these numbers, I will put the results here. But then when I move it 1 step like below, it would there's already a value for this cell. But I would still multiply B by X. But what I would do, I would sum these 2 values. So that's how I can, for example, go from like a 2 cell input to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cell inputs using the idea of this filter and what we call transpose convolutions. So again, this is easier to understand, but for like the input of 2 by 2, this works the same way. You can get this idea and basically transfer it to a more dimensional input, higher dimensional input. So I put like a basically kind of a demo here too, but I have a source here that is better. Like check this source, it's pretty good. Like I put the source here so you can actually take a look. I love this library. This is actually really good. You can learn a whole lot about like the transpose convolutions. Okay, so we are right on the track. I'm not going to go through all this stuff. I just wanted to basically talk about these important concepts and one important model that is being used for semantic segmentation. And that is called, which you would hear a lot, basically, this is the model. It's called UNet architecture. And the reason it's called UNet because it looks like U, right? So what does it do? Basically, we talked about the limitation of all these previous architectures. We can't use basically all convolution because of all the limitations that we had. So we decided to go with this encoder, basically decoder architecture. But this one also has limitation. Like one limitation that Sergio mentioned, sometimes we lose actually information. Sometimes we would get the results back, but the result or these boundaries or like, the thresholds or the segments are not well defined, are not fine, basically grained, they're fuzzy. They have a lot of mistakes, and I'll show you how they would look like. So in order to resolve that, so one example is this. So these architectures that we talked about have problem with producing fine-grained segmentation. So you might have this is your label, and it's good, but it's not good enough. This is the predicted segments. So you can see it's very ugly. It's just like it gives you like a rough estimation, but it has lost a lot of information. So how can we address that? One way to address it is something called skip connections. Again, if you're familiar with ResNets, are you guys familiar with ResNets? I guess you are, right? Any ResNet people here? Again, I don't want to get into the ResNet stuff because that's okay. Sergio says yes. I see Daniel has a question. I'll try to get back to you, Daniel, just to make sure we're not going to run out of time. Uh, okay, so the same idea as ResNet. In order to get information from a specific location and not lose so much information, for this specific architecture, when we are building up, when we are upscaling the matrices, we use some information from here, like a skip. We basically use a skip connection from here to here to transfer some knowledge from the matrices that were in their, again, normal state before downsampling to improve the information here. So like a feedback loop. You can basically think about it that way. So we use feedbacks. Again, it would make it easier for you to understand. Like a skip connection is like a feedback loop. We use feedback coming from the previous layers before downsampling to refine basically these the upsampling or upscaling stage of these matrices that we have. So that's actually the main core of this unit architecture. So again, you would see here that we had this input image. And of course, it's one-dimensional, it's grayscale, and that's the basically height and width of the model. We pass it through different convolutions. These are two convolutional layers, 64, 64, and these are the number of kernels, number of features. So again, we create 64, again, another 64. And look, we are keeping the same dimension. We still have 570 by 570, but then here it gets actually, it shrinks. So the dimension height and width is going to shrink, and we're creating this long sparse feature set. And then we pass the output of this to another, again, this is the max pooling layer, global averaging. Convolution layers, again, more features. Again, this 128, you can see how we went from 64 to almost double. So again, now we create more features. 128 features, 128 features, and the dimension is shrinking. Downsampling, right? We're downsampling. We're decoding. And again, we're getting further and further into the kernel size and the number of features we create. And this is where we stop. So now this part is called, again, what was it called? Who can tell me? You can put in the chat. Then I would know you were listening. What is this left side of this architecture called? What do we call this, the left side of this architecture? I'll wait for more people to respond. Just make sure no one is falling asleep. Excellent, encoder. So we are encoding information and shrinking, right? And now we have to, at some point, upscale. So we concatenate this, we use the output of this, and I told, like, we use some of the techniques that we just talked about here. The transpose convolution plus a skip connection to basically upscale. Again, I want you to get the whole general idea. So don't focus on the detail. Detail would be pretty easy later as you get more exposed to the architecture and the code. Once you get the idea, things would fall into place. So that's the whole idea of an encoder decoder and how we shrink, we build upon, we use a skip connection to transform information and learn a better fine-tuned segmentation result. And eventually I would have this output segmentation map, which again is hopefully like we can, again, the size of this output is not actually the same size of this. In this case, it could be the same. You can build the same height and width. And if you pay attention, it's two-dimensional. Again, it doesn't matter that much. Like the numbers can change. The filter number, you can change them to 128, 256. So just get the core idea. Like these two can be one. You want to go from 1 to 1. So this could be 1 on a grayscale. But that's how we build units. Okay, let's get into the notebook. Oh, I hope my files are here still. Okay, there we go. I'm using Google Colab. Again, you guys are familiar with Google Colab. It's pretty nice to use. You have to upload your data here. Again, check my GitHub repository. Make sure to, if you want to use it, you can go through it and then reproduce the same thing. I've added the pre-trained model, so you can use the pre-trained model to fine-tune that model. Or I've actually provided the training code too. You can train it and optimize it. But let's look at this. Again, don't worry about the syntax. Once you go through it, syntax is just like a background noise. So it would, you get familiar with some of the libraries that we're using. You might be actually familiar with some of them. Image read, basically is a nice library. It basically reads your images in form of PNG, JPG, and would just like show the images to you. One of my example images that I have is this. So I want to train a model based on sets of images that I have. This is not one of them. I'm going to test my pre-trained model or trained model on this just to see how it's working. So again, the result, this one should not be as part of your training set or validation set. That's very important. I see so many researchers, scientists, engineers, even senior, they make the same mistake. By accident, consciously or unconsciously, make sure that the examples that you use to test your, again, model is not part of your training or evaluation set. So this is the image that I want to test. I'm going to use, I've basically prepared my training data in form of this HP H5 Pi data set. It's again, you can read more about it. It's nice. It's like a package that creates a hierarchy for you, like train, test, label, and you can basically upload your label, train, and test, and basically load them in form of tensors and use them. Again, these are all provided to you, so the syntax is not that important. You get familiar with those. I've actually included that in my GitHub repository too. Just make sure you unzip the file. Just read the README and unzip the file. And this is the unzipped version of the. Actually, I haven't put it here. I have to upload it, but I think I have the zip file. But it doesn't matter. We're not going to train it because it's going to take a long time. We're going to use the pre-trained model for today. So if you want to train it from the scratch, make sure to unzip it, put it in this directory, and basically make sure the directory is okay and start training. I'll show you how you can do it shortly. But if you look, this is how I'm loading my data that is stored in this format. And I'm getting the train data and I'm basically showing the image. So again, this is one of them. If I so there are 100 images in this trained data set. So we are going to train based on 100 images. Since we're not going to make predictions for the hood, let's say basically what we want to do, we want to basically, I forgot to talk about the a little bit. I think we talked a lot about the theory, but like I'm just want to make sure we catch up on time. So that's why I'm sorry for my. So data that we're going to use is collected from the self-driving car simulator called Car Loss Simulator. So again, this is also in my GitHub repository. It's a pretty nice repository, like Carla. Let me see if I have it open here. Actually, I can show it to you. You can, this is open source. You can download a lot of data sets from it, and you can, there you go. Oops. So this is open source simulator for autonomous driving research. It has tons of open source data set that you can use. And many researchers use this to actually train their models for autonomous driving, semantic segmentation. So we're going to use this. So the data is coming from here. What I'm going to do, I'm going to actually do the segmentation based on specific classes. So what are the classes that I want to use? I want to use these classes. I want to be able to basically segment pedestrians, roads, vehicles, traffic signs, and I don't care about all the other stuff. So I would just like classify them as 0. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the label data that you download should have those categories. That's why it's really hard sometimes to find labeled data, basic annotated data, and that's the main one of the main steps of training a model or using a pre-trained model. So the data that I'm using here, they're pretty basically they're labeled for you based on these 5 categories, and we can basically use them to train the model and or do the evaluation. So when we look here, I'm basically looking at my trained data set. We have 100 batches. You can see this shape. So 100 samples, 100. The first one is 100 batches. That's why it's 4-dimensional. It has basically 4 dimensions. The first is the number of samples. The second one is the basically height and width and basically the depth, RGB. And if you can basically play around with it. I hope this is still loaded. Oops, I gotta load them again. Let's see, you gotta do all the stuff again. Data HP5. Oh, actually, so again, that's actually good that this is happening. You just make sure your data is uploaded to this directory that you want to use. So that's very important. So what I would do, I would basically go to my the GitHub repository that I had, and this is the one. I have actually I put the data on my desktop, so I'll find the data set. So it's called data.hp5. I'll try to download it, upload it here. It would take a while, but meanwhile, I'm not gonna wait for it. I have like actually a PDF version of it. So let's talk about that. Does that make sense to everyone so far? Is everything clear? Okay, that's good. Let me see where that PDF actually go. Oh, that's the one, copy of semantic. Okay, so once you upload your data, then you can do different things with it. So you can actually index to look at the data, get the number of samples, and so forth. So that's what you can print. You can print the data, you can print the shape of each, and then once this index would basically print individual instances of your data. So that's the first image. And when you get the shape of it, it would basically return this to you, like 320, 800, and basically by 3. One other fancy thing again that you can do is like this image show. It's pretty cool. Like you can basically look at different images that you have as part of your train label. So I told you how you can access either train data or train label from this HDF5 data set that I provided. So that's how you can get the labels. And it's the same thing. Like, for example, this data returns all the labels. If you want to get the 80th label in your data set, then you can like index it like that, and you can even like show it using this image show. So see how I'm basically uh, showing, giving it this input. This division by 4, it would just like making it normalized. So the color would turn into black or more grayish. You don't even need to use that, but if you want to make it fancier, you can do that. And then you can look at different instances of your labels. So you can see these are segmented. Like this is probably like a sign. You can see some of the pedestrians like very far, some of the cars here, the street, and we don't care about anything else. Let me bring up the chat. Okay. So what we're going to do now, we're going to again use Keras. From Keras.layers, we're going to improve conv2D, conv2D transpose. Again, the same concepts that we talked about. The inputs. So again, don't worry about these. Once you run it one time, you don't need to memorize it. Like consider this as a cheat sheet. And usually that's what you should do when you're working at the industry or even at the lab. So the whole concept is to understand what's going on under the hood, which we just covered. So now we're going to define the unit model. So again, you can see it's a whole bunch of convolution and then conv2D transpose. Again, who can tell me what's above this line? Like what's happening here? What are we doing here in the first segment, in the first portion of this input? Encoder, right? So in just like a few lines of code, you can basically define your encoder of unit. That's how cool that is. And these are all encoders. And if you remember that chart that I showed you here, we're defining all these ones. All these ones. And I told you there are like a whole bunch of convolutional layers, and you can get fancy with it. Basically, you can, it doesn't need to be, I keep closing that window. I should stop. Let me see where that window went. There you go. So basically, you can play around with the number of filters. I told you, you don't need to have exactly 16. You can have like even 32 and then increase it to 64. So these are basically some stuff that you can do to optimize your model further. All the other steps here is for decoding. So that's why you use conv2D transpose. And we imported that from Keras layers. That's how easy that is. And again, we want to reconstruct. It's 128. The padding, again, I'll just like quickly talk about the inputs of this. A stride of 2, it means like like that magnifier that I told you, if you remember, like that rectangular magnifier, we pick it up, we move it 2 steps, we go to the next pixel. Again, we move it up, we basically move it 2 steps, go to the next one, and then go down. The same thing. So you can again play around with it. You can actually go one by one step by one step. Like it will give you a higher resolution, but it would be more expensive in terms of computation. Same padding would basically make sure you would return the same basically input dimension. The same dimension for your outputs that would resemble your inputs. For example, if your inputs image was 3 by 3, if you use the same padding, the output of your kernels would also be 3 by 3. So that's what you can do. Or if you use valid, that's another option. It doesn't use any basically extra padding. So it like the dimension might shrink. So you can play around with those. And that's how I would basically define my model. So there's a model.summary here that will give you a summary of your model, the decoder part, encoder part, all these learnable parameters. And towards the end of it, it can tell you how many trainable params you have. It's close to a million, like 2 million parameters. So, and that's coming from all these convolutional layers. Like you have to learn them, have a backprop, learn, and also the dense layers. So again, we prepare the data. There's nothing fancy about it. It's like a class. Again, treat these as a cheat sheets. You don't even need to memorize it. It's just like knowing that's the concept. All we're trying to do, we're trying to access the train data from the H5 pi data set and also the labels, separate them, create tensors off of them. Like here, we create tensors. We basically change the labels to categories. So that's the part that I was talking about here. So this guy here, this line is responsible for that. Again, you don't need to memorize it. You can use these codes as cheat sheet. And usually this is what you should do. And now you can, this read sequence class basically gets the input of that H5 pi and would return batches of data. Batches mean like samples of your data with the labels. So examples, labels, examples, labels that can be fed to the specific model that we defined here. So now we're going to train the model. Again, I've done some fancy stuff in here. You don't even need to do those, but this is just to get you familiar with some of the techniques that some researchers do. You can easily use learning rate as a fixed number. I think you're familiar with learning rate. For example, 0.001. An adjustable learning rate, make sure you're not going to get stuck in local minima or local maxima. I hope you're familiar with the concept of local minima and local maxima. But if you're not, I'm just like, again, I'll put a link in my page so you can follow that up. So this adjustable learning rate, make sure if the learning rate doesn't change after 15 epochs, it randomly changes that. It decays that. Decays means it decreased basically the learning rate by a fixed value. So it makes sure the model keeps learning and it doesn't get stuck into these valleys or hills. So this is actually a trick that, again, some people don't do, but I love doing. So again, I put it here for your information so you can use it and play around with it. I'm using Atom Optimizer for, again, the optimization. Again, I'm not going to get into that. I'm sure you're familiar with this. And also the loss. Loss is pretty simple. Categorical cross entropy. And I think you're familiar with that. It's just like basically softmax. Basically the loss of each, because we have different classes, right? We define 5 classes for semantic labels, pedestrians, signs. So we want to optimize for 5 of those 5 classes. Usually when we have multiple classes, we have categorical cross entropy, and you can easily type it here, and the model basically learns to optimize that, or basically reduces the loss based on all the categories that we have. And these are some fancy stuff to basically save the checkpoints so you can use the pre-trained model again. And that's it. And the last part, when you train the model, I'm using actually a pre-trained model here, the model that I've trained. So I've actually included that in the GitHub repository so you can use it directly to optimize it. So that's how you would load it. Make sure it's basically uploaded here. So you can see, well, I think this is the copy of, so it's not uploaded actually here now, but if you open a live collab, you should upload it there. And it should be exactly the same name under this folder, content, sample data. I'm sorry, not here. Usually the default directory that you would read from is this one, content. So the stuff that you would put should be under this folder, content, not the sample data, content. Okay. So that's how easy it is to use a pre-trained model. You just load the model and you basically check the prediction, and that's the basically it says give me the maximum number, like likelihood that you have predicted for those labels, segment like pixels. And you can even show it. That's the cool thing. Like you can, I'm sorry about the noise. You can use this again, image show library, and you can fit it, the prediction, and show basically what we wanted to predict. Like this is the example data that I had. Do you remember? I had one example file that I set aside, and it was not in my training set. It shouldn't be in a training. If it's in a training set, you're cheating. Your model is learning the pattern, so it's not a true example of the word, like the way it would behave. So, and again, these are some fancy functions that you can use. Don't worry about the syntax. Again, there's nothing special about it. Again, if you're not familiar with them, once you read them once or twice, you know what's happening. But we're using overlay, so that's why I told you the getting the concept is really important. The syntax is just background noise. Overlay is now we want to put this on top of the input image that I had to see if this would look correct. And there we go. I can even do some fancy stuff like changing the color to again make it look cooler. And if you look at my original photo, it was this one, right? I trained a model and I used the trained model and I called it pre-trained weights. I used the pre-trained weights that came from the basically trained model that I had to make a prediction on an example that the model hadn't seen before. And it came up with this segmentation, which is pretty good. Still, it's not perfect. You can see like edges are not very well defined. These ones are not very well defined. Like maybe there are some pedestrians like that are not defined. So I put an assignment here for some of you who might be interested. Again, the result is not perfect. You can try increasing the number of epochs if you want to. Again, the training script is here. You can play around with the optimizer, play around with this like learning rates, the epoch, basically the specific loss to optimize the model. So here, I was training for 35 epochs. So that was the start of the training that I commented out because I don't want to run it. You can run it for more epochs, like let's say 100 epochs, to see if over time the model will converge or give you a better result. And then see if this would get better. Other stuff you can do, you can play around the kernel numbers. You have like this pretty cool architecture now. You can play around with the number of convolutions, the padding. You might not want to use the same padding. You want to use a value, basically valid padding. The relu activation. Maybe you want to change it to 10H or some other activation functions, or even a stride, and see if the model would produce like a better response. And again, I think we have 2 more minutes. But don't worry about the syntax. All I wanted to mention, once you get the concept, the core concept of what semantic segmentation is, that's all. Everything is background noise. You get familiar with it pretty quickly. You have access to all these resources, so it's going to be pretty easy for you after 1 or 2 interaction with the Jupyter Notebook and the code itself. Okay, do you guys have any question? I'll pass it to maybe Andrew, and then you guys have any questions, just let me know.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thank you, Sam. That was really great. So I guess I'll just give a couple more seconds if you have any questions. But in the meantime, yeah, so like I mentioned at the beginning, so we have 2 more sessions. Both those are going to be NLP next week. And then after those sessions, we have the closing ceremony. So if you miss any sessions, just a reminder, we have some of the quizzes available on Discord. And yeah, so if there's no questions, I guess we can call that the end of the session. So thank you all for joining us. And thank you so much again, Sam, for such an amazing session.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks everyone for joining. Yeah.
All right, bye everyone. Have a good night.
Goodbye, guys. Thank you.